Hail Seekers, and welcome to Everyday Sacred.
I'm Michael.
And I'm Shane. We're seeking ways and wisdom to make our everyday lives more sacred, and we hope you'll join us on our journey.
We research and discuss a range of topics on the podcast, from history, religion, and mythology, to practical habits we can hope enrich your daily lives.
Our goal here is to explore all the different paths that humanity has taken up the spiritual mountain, bring them back to Earth, and make them accessible to folks from all walks of life.
Thanks for joining us. Today's episode's about family. And we'll just say it up front because it's not going to be, we don't have a lot of structure for this because really we're trying to kind of wrap our own minds around it. It seems on the surface just such a straightforward topic. Like family's family, we all know what that means. We all have one or have reasons we don't have one. But
exactly. And family is sacred. You might hear people say that exact statement. I don't know if we'll really explore this through like a religious, spiritual lens, maybe a little bit of a historic lens, just as an idea of sacred in the most mundane way. Like, your family are the reason you are who you are, and that I think that is one thing that is true across the spectrum. But beyond that, family is as different as the 7.5 billion people that live on this world. Family doesn't have to be your father and your mother and your brother and sister. You can be adopted. You can have an estranged family member. You can be an orphan. Your parents can get divorced, and you can develop a family of friends. Michael and I think, in many ways, I've always considered you like a brother because we've been friends since I was basically a child. and in many ways, there are a lot of things that we, know about each other and in our relationship that members of our family don't know. And then there's other, we have overlapping relationship between friends and families, and it's interesting, but there's no one definition of family.
There isn't. It doesn't take a lot of digging to uncover the weirdness of trying to make it too specific and scientific in my mind. Because, if you're defining family by people you share genetic information with, mm-hmm. we know that like the human race as a whole is not very genetically diverse. I think I remember from college, my anthropology teacher always liked to point out that like your average two chimpanzees, if you compare them, have something like 10 times the amount of differences genetically between them than any two human beings. Like we're all genetically so related because there were some hardcore bottlenecks in our past that, even the most wildly different people you can see and imagine, deep down we're closer, than it ever seems. And then if you try and go the other end of the spectrum and you just define it as this person is the person that raised me, that's very complicated for a lot of people. That nuclear family thing, you've got one father, you've got one mother, they were there your whole life. You grew up in a suburb or something. I don't know, but
yeah, this idea of the American nuclear family, which growing up in America, we were always subjected to it, but I never really saw it.
Sure.
In my own life, I did. My parents were together. They were divorced, but I was an adult by the time that happened. I felt like I was more part of a dysfunctional family, but we did have the nuclear unit. Yeah. Mother, father, myself, brother, and then my younger sister.
Mm-hmm. But of course, now you've got to, not to get too far into your personal situation, but now there's like step siblings involved, and there's, so even that has gotten far more complicated. Then you've got potentially, relatives you don't even know about in a lot of cases for a lot of people. I've got a half sister that I've never met.
Right. And part of the reason that we're talking about this is that we're both going through some things in our family, and both of us recently got DNA tests, out of curiosity, mm-hmm. to look at our genetics. And I've always been curious about my family history, but I've never done the ancestry thing. I've never really looked into my lineage. But one of the things that I learned in my DNA test is that I also may have a half sister. And that sort of indicates that my father, the man who raised me my entire life, might not be genetically related to me. It seems increasingly likely that that's the case.
Mm-hmm.
And it's something that I've been thinking about. My mom had hinted at it for years, and I just kind of like didn't really worry about it. Like, he's my dad, it doesn't really matter. And sort of have come across it as well, and it doesn't change anything, but it definitely reframes things.
My situation's similar, except it's my mother who found out her biological father wasn't actually her father. She does know her biological father, that he did raise her, but she was told her whole life that wasn't her actual father. And so you wonder how that knowledge might have affected their childhood development, and like, were they as close as they would have been had he known that was his first child,
Mm-hmm.
and not another man's child? I mean, by all everything I've heard, he was loving and there and kind, maybe a little distant, but it's a little different, I think, in that culture. The relationship between the women are very much the head of the household and in charge of the children and child rearing.
Mm-hmm.
And my grandfather spends a lot of time in the Philippines, like literally half the year. But again, yeah, just you wonder what would have been different and what is different. And now, if you think back like 2 generations ago or so, it would be hard to know. Like, we probably never have this conversation because you would just never know if you looked remotely like your father, and
Yeah.
having known your father, you look like him. And
Mm-hmm.
like my grandfather, who I thought wasn't my grandfather, he looked as kind of a brown Asian guy, a lot like the other brown Asian guy that I would have thought was my. So it didn't really, there wasn't anything that you would have seen to make you really think anything different. And
No,
so
and it's similar. Like, my father and my biological father are both like Northern European.
yeah, 50, 60 years ago, we probably would have no idea. Ancestry's passed down by story, kind of by mythology within the family, where you
Mm-hmm.
tell stories about these people that, yeah, when you have a way to really track them, you're like, well, it was more a story than was actually real life,
Yeah.
actual fact.
Mm-hmm.
But did it really affect you any less, even finding out those stories aren't true?
Right, and which is more important, really? Like, is your genetic history your family, or is the story of how your parents met, how your grandparents met, what you've gone through, what you've experienced together as a family? Is that more important?
Yeah,
I don't have an answer, and I don't think many people do. There's much more in-depth studies on family than anything we're going to cover in this conversation.
Oh, absolutely. As a personal anecdote, I have a friend who she had a DNA test, and she was saying that she grew up and her whole identity revolved around this interaction between an Italian and Greek sides of her family. They would tell the story, and it was something like 100 years old. Like, it was like a big deal when they first immigrated and stuff. But she got her test, and it's like, that's like 10% of my genetic makeup. Like, it's some of the smallest parts of who I am genetically. But when it comes to family history, it's some of the most influential aspects of how we see ourselves and how we see our family history. She was like, it's just kind of funny to see it there and know it's there, but to then be like, why is it such a big deal when we're like Irish people through and through? I think one thing that's really changing, I've always said, is that a lot of Americans have this kind of like whisper of the Native American indigenous genetics in their family lineage.
Oh, it's all a lot of common family legend.
Yeah, it goes back, 200 years easily in popular writing. When somebody was trying to be mysterious, they'd say, there's a bit of Indian in him, on his in his grandmother's side or something like that. Kind of like in Europe, they would say, like, I believe the woman's might be Egyptian, even though that never meant Egyptian. It just meant foreign and strange. It could mean all kinds of things. And I think a lot of like Americans, so we do a lot of weird things because of that as a culture, right? So like Native American mascots. I think that like worked for a people that saw themselves as coming from that, just like people with like cougar mascots and stuff are like, yeah, there's a wild side to us and things like. Now it's mostly just kind of comes off as a little racist and appropriative. I think a lot of people are finding out, actually there are no Native American ancestry in my family. But like I took the test, I was told there was, and it turned out there was a little bit. So definitely like with my great grandmother or something. But it makes no real difference because I don't even know what tribe. Like I'm not Native American in the sense that as a culture it's completely remote to me, and I don't pretend otherwise.
Did it just show up as like North American indigenous? Did it have a region or anything?
It said Native American.
Yeah, okay.
Literally just said Native American. Which is, like I said, it was expected. I feel like it would be really silly to start really identifying that. Same with the Jewish ancestry. But I guess it is there though, like it's interesting to find out. And like and more than that, it was how I was able to find out that I had a totally different grandfather, because I was part Jewish along with some of my Chamorro cousins, which should not have been we're Guamanians, Filipino people. You just wouldn't expect Ashkenazi Jew to like be a part of that. But it was, definitely. So it helped us detect the fact that what we considered family was different than what we were all told and all believed. Even after the person that could have told us otherwise was passed away. It's very interesting. And I think, to break it down, a person's made out of two different things. You have your genetics and you have your blood, your body, literally, that came from another human being. And then there's that mental part of yourself, the memes, as they call them, these like mind viruses that replicate, that you pass on to other people. And so even if your father is genetically different than you, the fact that I hear you use phrases even as a kid that I would hear him say,
and they were unusual.
Yeah,
they weren't like common with the rest of our friends. They were like,
so even
Oklahomanisms.
Yeah, absolutely, they stood out and they were different, and it was cool, and it helped define who you were to me. And so even if you don't pass on your father's actual genes, if you have a son, he will be saying something. He'll be saying phrases, maybe choosing his words in a way that are influenced by your father because you were his father, and you'll pass those along, and they'll be part of the human race a long, long time from now. And in that same respect, like I've got a son and I want him to be around you because, well, he becomes like a hybrid of all these different people mentally. Physically, he's my descendant, sure, but who he is as a person is a separate thing, and that's something you're giving to him to become the next version of me that goes on into the world. So I try to separate those two, especially when it comes to the blood and adoption and things like that. Like, and really, if you ask yourself, I think this could be different for different people, but like, it's kind of more important that the idea of the person that I am moves on in my family rather than just my genes. They're a mixed grab bag. There's some really good stuff in there and there's some really bad stuff in there, which, like if you could pick and choose, and we're probably 2 generations away from really being able to literally pick and choose those genes. But arguing that that's no longer your descendant just because they were a little more tailored would be kind of silly. But the mental part of me is what I also really want to live on and be a part of the future conversations that happen and shape the human race going forward. And I feel a little good knowing that I will be part of that voice, because
Right.
my family is a voice. That line between me and my son and me and my father starts to blur when you see it as like these are ideas and beliefs. Some of them get dumped to the side because, you know, maybe they're a little racist, or maybe they're a little like they're just dated. They're like from a time that no longer works. But the ones that do work, just like genes, the ideas that do fit get carried forward because they work.
Yeah, it's a bit of that classic nature versus nurture. In many ways, I feel like those stories and the like living myths of family histories and migrations and travel matter more than the genetic material, especially like you said earlier, until this generation, unless it was clear from the child's skin color or really obvious physical features, you might not have known who your father was.
Yeah.
You probably knew who your mother was, but that's even not 100% true in every culture, in every
absolutely.
circumstance.
I've heard of people and they were kind of raised by a sibling who they thought was their mother, or who was actually their mother.
Yeah, they were raised by their older
Yeah.
sister and
Exactly.
found out as an adult that their older sister was actually the woman who raised them, who they didn't think was their mother, was their mother.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yeah.
I mean, it's a common movie plot as well, but it happens in real life.
It really does. Well, if you have a 16-year-old girl, especially in older generations, that gives birth to a child.
You hide that.
Yeah, I mean, the mom might just be like, this is my youngest, rather than,
Yeah.
you know, this is my first grandchild.
Yeah, there's a lot of cultural pressure, and that's a big part of what defines family in different areas. And we haven't even touched on, you know, the choices you make and the cycle of abuse. There's absolutely no reason to maintain like a relationship with an abusive parent just because they're family, and I want to make that clear to any listeners. Like it's a you know, you hear arguments on both sides, and they, you know, people say, you know, forgive your parents, and I believe that you should forgive your parents to yourself, because
Sure.
you can't carry that, but you don't need to say it's okay. Forgive them by letting it go and
Yeah.
and bringing them back into your life.
There's a difference between forgiveness and forgetfulness.
Exactly.
You if somebody screws you over enough times, if it's your mother, you should probably find a way to emotionally cope with that and say, you know, you were doing what you could with what you had. You should have done better.
Mm-hmm.
But you don't then need to give them more opportunities to screw you over in your life, especially if they're very just emotionally manipulative, you know, very abusive, like, because sometimes people aren't trying to get better.
No, and some people actually lack the capacity to get better.
Yeah.
Like a truly deep narcissist is unable to admit mistakes and therefore cannot learn from mistakes.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Like, and it's the forgiveness part comes from recognizing that this abuser in your life is a human being who has their own brokenness, that part of them that, like, malignant narcissism is a very dangerous mental illness, but those who have it are suffering in their own way.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the forgiveness, is being like, my abusive mother, father, uncle, ex-lover, they genuinely hurt me, but the forgiveness is recognizing that they have a problem that they can't solve, and you can't solve it either.
Yeah.
And you shouldn't.
It gets so complicated with family. Like most people, I've noticed that my family, we were always far more likely to attack each other for things that we'd never attack a friend for. Like, you're so much harder on family, and at the same time, you're so much more comfortable yelling at them. Paradoxically, because you would think that in many instances you should treat them better because they're so close to you. But it's that closeness that brings out the ugliness sometimes in the relationship, and that and you've done it for so long that you don't think about it in terms of like, well, if I came over to, somebody I knew decently well and I started criticizing how dirty their house is or something, or some aspect about them that would be completely rude, and they'd say, well, if you got a problem, there's the door, like, don't let it hit you on the, on your backside on your way out. But with family, they're far more likely to just stand there and take it from you, and you're far more likely to give it.
Oh yeah. Sometimes it can be constructive, but often it's not.
I think the intention starts with constructive, but then those years of baggage, just weigh it down until it becomes a thing that it wasn't maybe intended to be. And it carries with it a lot of weight that shouldn't be a part of it, but it is. That's an important thing to kind of keep in mind. And one of the things that I think's hilarious, I don't know that being aware of it's helped me stop it, but I know it's there. And I like to think that that's a step on the road to try to be a little better about it.
I read somewhere once that you'll never love someone or hate someone as much as your family. Mm-hmm. And like children, when they're angry at their parents or their sibling, like, if you were to measure that anger, it's the same kind of anger that can lead to murder. Mm-hmm. And it can flash and disappear and turn back into adoration seconds later. And it's like, in that way, like, family helps us become who we are because they help us explore the range of emotions that we're capable of in a relatively safe-ish environment.
Yeah.
Because for the most part, like, you get in a fight with your sibling, especially as a kid, they're still going to be there the next day. You get in a fight like that with a friend or a lover, you'll never see them again. Family tends to stick around, but there's still a breaking point, and there should be, and that's where people can get in themselves or their family into trouble, is realizing that at a certain point it's not a sibling rivalry, it's not a lover spat, it's an unhealthy relationship, and it's abuse. Mm-hmm. And recognizing that you're not obligated to keep your family in your life, even though blood is thicker than water.
Yeah. I have to admit that don't have an awfully close relationship with some members of my family for that very reason. And it was one of the great lessons of my life that, it's okay to just walk away from this. Mm-hmm. Like, you don't need to keep coming back, and it's, especially when it's not making anything better for anybody. Like, it's almost wrong to keep coming back in and of mm-hmm. itself.
We both end up worse by our interaction.
Absolutely. And that's, no matter whose fault it is, if you're going to try that again, you're going to have to grow up and change. By grow up, I mean like get some more tools in the toolkit, because obviously what you have is not working. And mm-hmm. and then you choose the kind of relationship you can have. I remember, was it Pema Chodron saying, start small, maybe go home for 2 minutes and talk to your mother and say, hey, I'm going to visit for 2 minutes, and they'll think you're crazy, but you show up and just try to make those 2 minutes work. And then over time, maybe you're going to stay for 10 minutes. Who knows? Maybe you never will get there. But at least if you were to have any relationship, even if it was only 2 minutes at a time, it's good and it's healthy, and people leave generally mm-hmm. okay, rather than weeping or hating. And so it's hard. As they say, like, you don't choose your family. Mm-mm. And sometimes, yeah, your family members are not people you would have ever chosen to be involved with at all. I always call it like the sins of the father, as a nod to the whole biblical idea, right, of passing sins down your family line. Of it's so easy to just take all the abuse that's been haunting your blood for so long and pass it down further and further into the future.
Mm-hmm.
And it was hard. It scared me when it took me a while to be comfortable with the thoughts of the idea of being a father, because I didn't want to be my father.
That can be scary.
Yeah. And it's so easy. I saw so many people, including my own father, say things like, well, at least I'm not my father.
Oh, yes.
And I think if you find yourself having to say that to your children, there's probably a reason.
Yeah, you're making an excuse for something.
Yeah.
I remember hearing that from my mother, and I'm like, so your own special kind of you, then.
And logically it makes no sense, right? Like, if you're going to set that bar, why would you find like the most abusive person in your life and make that's the goalpost, right? I just need to come in underneath that line. If I limbo right underneath that, I'm better, and that's all I need to be. Like, no, that's a shitty way to.
Yeah. You should aspire to something as a parent.
Maybe set a goal that's not based on the worst parent you ever had. Maybe don't even factor them into the equation of what kind of parent you want to be. That's probably a better starting point. And I waited until I could comfortably say that I never think in terms of, at least I'm not my dad, or my dad would have done this, or he's no part of the ideas of raising my own child. And that's how it should be.
Yeah, and I think you're humble enough to admit that your parents still shine through you. Mm-hmm. And like we all see that, for better or worse. But we have agency.
Certainly. Yeah, we have sovereignty. And like, if every action has that equal and opposite reaction, you know that everything they do and say affects you. But I do like to think that you do have control over how you assimilate that into yourself and how you give it back. And like, there's two ways to look at it. Like, my parents hit me a lot, so I'm gonna hit my kid a lot. Well, that would be an equal reaction there.
Yeah, that's straight pass through.
Yeah. or I have definitely know people that have gone the opposite route, and I've done it myself so far. I've never laid a hand on my child in anger. But because your parents hit you a lot, you've decided never to hit your children at all.
I'm going to hit them 0 times.
Exactly. And if I can't parent without physical abuse, then I just need to find a better way to parent. Like, or maybe, and my thing was like, not parent at all. So it's definitely so easy to pay that forward.
That passing down and that aspect, that makes me nervous as well when I think about the possibility of having a child, because I would still like to. I think one of the things that's been changing definitely over the last few weeks since I've had my DNA test, but even over the last couple of years as I've thought about it, is like I'm losing my attachment to the child necessarily being a product of my genetic material. I still think that, all else being equal, that's still my preference, to have my own kid. But knowing that the man who raised me and who I admire between my two parents, he's the one I've been closer to, has no genetic relationship to me, makes the idea of adopting or getting involved in, dating and marrying someone who already has a kid and helping to raise that child not much less intimidating. Where in the past, I think I had, whether I wanted to admit it or not, I think I had some attachment of like, I want my own kid.
Absolutely. And that's really interesting that, even at where you are now in your life, that new information can change so much so quickly. Mm-hmm. Not that you're an old man or anything. I don't know, you're not, but you're fully developed as a person, and mm-hmm. with plenty of people at your age, our fathers, or I was 35 when I became a dad, and I wouldn't have wanted to do it any earlier, in all honesty, personally. But I knew I have another friend who was raised by somebody he knew, though. I think at 2, somebody came in and his biological father was kind of out of the picture, and I think everybody was kind of happier for it in the end. He always knew that wasn't his biological father, but it was his dad, of course. And then he was in a situation where he was dating somebody, and he was like, I really felt like it was kind of meant to be almost, because I myself was raised by somebody other than my biological father, and so I just feel like that's part of the circle now for him.
And that's the story, right? That's the story that passes on, and even if it only happens 2 generations, it'd be like, we're the kind of men who we become fathers to different children.
Yeah. And being raised by somebody with that viewpoint, I think would leave a bigger impact on you and your relationship with your future children, than anything the genes have in there.
Mm-hmm.
Again, people debate over what's the greater thing. And I think that's fair. There's weird things in my family that I now realize are there because of genetics, now that we had the gene test, like an intense hatred for people chewing food with their mouth open.
Your whole family has mesophenia?
My whole family did. Yes. And when you're surrounded by people, it's common knowledge that people shouldn't, that you generally try to just keep your mouth kind of closed while you're chewing food, yeah. Right? You don't want to just be like going at it at a dinner table with a bunch of, it's not considered a refined behavior in our culture in general.
It's not good manners.
Exactly. But in my family, it was more than that, right? And so it became this thing that fit because of the genes that, any parents would tell you not to do it, and they would try and take the habit out of you to some degree. But in our family, it was like people, these poor children, they would visit like my brother to have his friend over, and that kid would leave traumatized. My father was not a delicate man.
No.
And so he might just throw his plate of food on the table and be like, "You disgust me," and get up and walk out, and this 11-year-old just had the worst day of his life up until that point, And it's funny how the genes and the attitudes, because my family was also fairly strict and stern. I don't know if it's because we're kind of German or something, and Asian coming together to create this melting pot of you do not act out a lot.
Yeah, two cultures with a history of strong family structures.
Yeah. So, yeah, the genes and the cultures just align to create this monster of a thing. And yeah, I go back and look at it, and I'm just like, man, that's why I'm such a jerk about that stuff. And everybody in my family is. I just thought it was normal because I was surrounded by it as a sentiment. And so it's kind of helped me kind of try and wake myself up from the things that you don't think of yourself as privileged. When somebody's humming a song and they're totally off key, and I have hardly any musical training up until 5 or 6 years ago, maybe 10 years ago, but it's like, can't you hear that you're totally off? That's really annoying. And then you get a gene test, and it's like, well, you probably are genetically predisposed to be able to sing in key at any time, and you're like, I just thought I paid attention better, I thought that was something I did, and it's not. It's just something that's part of your blood.
It's in your programming.
Exactly. But my father was a big singer. He was I remember singing The Little Mermaid in the car one time, and he's like, you're doing it all wrong, and he starts really going into it and stuff, and I never sang The Little Mermaid in the car again.
You didn't become a better singer because of this experience.
No, it scared me and embarrassed me more than anything. But again, had we had different genes in my family, my father might not have known or cared. So that's been interesting to look at my own family and our behaviors and the things that I think are just part of being a member of my family in terms of like, well, how much of that was kind of given to us by our genes. That's been enlightening, and I'm always on the journey of self-discovery, so it's been very interesting and kind of humbling, not gonna lie.
One of the things the sort of interesting things I learned from my report is that it was so vanilla, down to the fact that I have a genetic predisposition to prefer vanilla over chocolate. And, you know, my background is like over 96% Irish English and no health warnings. You know, I paid extra to get the health screening and learn that I'm healthy from it.
Yeah, and that you'll generally probably be healthy.
Yeah, and that
I think that's cool though.
Yeah, I have a genetic marker for like potentially needing glasses in my older years. But they said because of that, it didn't really change it from average. But what it means is that I could easily pass that on. So my child could very well need glasses if me and my partner both had this gene. Though I am no more than average chance of needing glasses. My father's had glasses his entire life. My father also prefers chocolate to vanilla.
Oh,
there's the difference.
Those wacky genes.
Yeah.
I know we're not talking about ethnicity a whole lot, but I gotta say that I think it's kind of cool because I've always known that I'm this like crazy mixture of different people. And when people, it's kind of weird sometimes when I see people identify so strongly with one culture because they really do have that heritage and that family history and all these things. And for me, it's like, I've just always felt like such a strange mixture that even when I call myself Chamorro, it feels weird, even though I'm more Chamorro than I am anything else. I'm not even
You're
from
still
Guam.
less than 50%.
Exactly. Yeah, quite a bit less. Because my mother herself was only half Guamanian.
Yeah.
And so, she was a mixture of Asian peoples. And my father was a bit of a mixture of European peoples. And then they mixed together, thanks to the U.S. military and the Navy. So, and there's a lot of kids like me for that very reason. But it makes it hard, like I see myself as American, sure, but like at the same time, sometimes I wish that I could so strongly identify with one thing instead of being part Jewish and part Bengali and part Guamanian, Filipino, Irish, English, German.
Right.
Like it's just all over.
You're a citizen of the world, Michael.
Yeah, apparently. It's just this huge list to where it starts to lose meaning instead of gain more meaning.
I guess one of the last things I'd say about a family from the genetic perspective is I think it was interesting that like over 96% blew my mind, down to knowing like what county in Ireland I was probably from, or my and that was sort of the indicator that my patronage, because my mother has always told me that this other man is very Irish, and now I know.
Absolutely.
But there's a potential of connecting with relatives in Ireland.
Yeah.
And in many ways that's fascinating to me. Even if it's 5-6 generations past, seeing someone who is that distant of a genetic relative and seeing, what we might have in common. And I've always felt some affinity for Irish culture. I think it's a fascinating culture, but I never identified with it so strongly as an Irish person. I just admired, Celtic art and Ireland is a cool place. But yeah, I don't know. It's an interesting thing to explore now that I have this genetic knowledge that I might visit the county of Mayo.
And then when you have a kid armed with that genetic knowledge, it'll start to bring those family stories in line with the genetics even still, right? Because you'll have knowledge that the people before you maybe just didn't have access to, again, 50 years ago. And so that's what I'm trying to think of now with my son. It's like I need to reconcile what I know genetically about myself with the stories that do exist inside my family and really try to put it into a perspective that just better equips him.
I'm really curious. I might not be around to see too much of it, but how much the concept of family will change over the coming generations, because we have access to this data that we never had before. And how is that going to, because I still firmly believe that human beings, what really sets us apart is the stories that we tell. That's how we build identity, how we craft these various threads of identity that have created human culture over our history, is because we're able to tell stories and to remember things in a narrative way. And we will continue to tell stories about ourselves and our families moving into the future, but we will be able to look at the kind of information that even as a child I didn't really imagine having access to, except as like science fiction, and now I have a report. We're still not quite at being able to pick and choose our genetic markers, but that seems very plausible.
I've read that there are several people alive today, just for a glimpse into what the future could bring and what we might need to adapt to, where their mother had a particular genetic disorder to where her mitochondrial DNA was not good to pass on. And so that doctors were able to take a donor for mitochondrial DNA and do that kind of in vitro thing and implant it. And so on the planet, there I believe more than one person that's walking around with a mother and a father, and you could say another mother. And that just is amazing to think about.
That is. And I would imagine that they would have to have, I mean, in vitro itself has been around a little while, but would they pick up some of their carrier mother's genetic material, incubating in a womb over that time? You're literally, you might have started with a cell or a clump of cells from another woman, but you still grew up in your mother.
Yeah.
And like, you're still made up of her material and what she ate and her habits and the music she played and what, all of that before you're born. So you really are like, yeah, this combination of three people.
You really are. And that's not even taking into the account that often people will have the DNA of more than one person. Is a very interesting thing to read about, and it goes beyond the scope of this podcast or my knowledge. Many people have DNA from their grandmother in their body, that the cells that were just inside the woman as she was
so birth. Not like a mix of genetics that your mom carried forward, but like literal material,
literal actual material from that body. And that's just when we think of like who we are and what we're made of, and we put it into a broader concept of like what are alive, what's dead. Were the pieces of my body on Mars once, like some of the atoms that make up, like, does that make me Martian now? Like,
right.
These are like, so much is based on perspective. If you never take the time to think about what that perspective means, then you don't know how your perspective of what you consider family, deep down, you don't know how that affects the other people you see. Like, are you subconsciously seeing them differently than you would if you really sat down and identified what you felt? And so I think everybody can really just take a little time once in a while to think about what family is and like how you see yourself and how you define other people through family. And how does your culture do it? How did your own parents do it? What kind of preconceived ideas do you carry around with you? Could these affect your other beliefs about things like gay marriage and adoption, single parents adopting children, things like that? Because they do. And they make us who we are. And they will change how we interpret the world. And it's why it's worth talking about, worth having that discussion, and especially when you're trying to know who you are, which I think everybody should do.
It's part of the sacred journey.
Mm-hmm.
As an
Absolutely.
individual, as an independent, as an interdependent.
And if all things are connected, it's good to know how you draw the lines.
Right. And like you said in the beginning, in a very literal way, we are one big human family. Like I had no idea that, like, because chimpanzees, like you mentioned, to me, they look the same.
And there's so few of them compared to us.
Right.
You know what I mean? Like sheer numbers. But yeah, a vastly more genetic diversity in pretty much any species than in human beings.
And we still can't get along. Maybe it's because we're so close. It's like,
but we can't get
it's
along.
an extension
in our
of that sibling fight. Like, you look different than me. You're totally different. You're not my real dad. And
Get
that
your
turns
Barbies
into...
out of my room. Don't bring them back here. We all need to grow up a little.
Mm-hmm. Oh, I can definitely vouch for that, I think.
Yeah.
As a species, as a culture, like, it's about time to grow up.
Mm-hmm.
Clean your room. All right. I think that was a pretty interesting conversation. I hope, this is something we'll follow up on again. I'd like to actually do some more deep research, look into the family unit in some ancient cultures and in some contemporary cultures and how it's evolved. I was
Mm-hmm.
thinking, right, there's tribal structures, there's clan structures in like Scotland and Ireland as well. I don't know how families functioned in ancient Mesopotamia, Egypt, Rome too much, except for the higher ups,
Mm-hmm.
the patrician families. But I think that's an interesting historical perspective because, we've always had family units of some kind. We've always been a very tribal species.
And adoption was a very popular thing in those cultures, the ancient ones.
Mm-hmm.
And if you think about it, because so many more people lost their lives. You lost your parents, you lost your children. And
There's
so
war and famine and...
Yeah. How did they navigate these things? I don't know.
I guess there is actually a lot of information in Rome. So many Roman emperors' sons and heirs were adopted. So
Mm-hmm.
common. No, it wasn't even a thing.
No,
some of this stuff has only become a big deal in the last 150 years in the United States. Or suddenly, like, adoption from someone of a different race is a big deal, or single parent adoption, or same sex adoption probably wasn't common in the past.
Yeah.
But there was more acceptance on those types of relationships in other cultures.
There often was, which is, as you said, it's weird because they had particular viewpoints about what we would call genetics today. Obviously, they didn't have the gene science, but they thought that a king's son would act like a king, no matter who raised him, no matter
Right.
where he was. All you have to do is read Herodotus and read about Cyrus the Great. That entire story really shows you how they thought. But even knowing that, adoption was commonplace, and it was definitely socially accepted, and it didn't seem to have any stigmas on it. So
yeah, and you could look at successive leaders like Commodus following Marcus Aurelius.
Mm-hmm.
Didn't really live up to this to the standards, to the bar set by his father, who we still read today.
Mm-hmm.
And people still make fun of Commodus. I saw Gladiator. This is a good topic. I'm glad we explored it a little bit. It's it strikes home with everyone, I think.
It does.
I think family is sacred for better or worse to everyone, because it whether it's a sore subject or a source of pride, it is sacred. Sacred doesn't necessarily mean positive.
No. This is like our 100 level class on it. And we'll focus in a little more now that we kind of introduced the topic and touched on a million little aspects of it. So
Yes.
In the future, we'll bring more.
Well, thank you for joining us on our shared journey in practical spirituality tonight.
Look for new episodes twice a month. If there's a topic you'd like us to cover on the show, please let us know. We're always looking for new ideas and concepts to explore, and we'd love to hear yours.
Also, today's episode's a good example. Let us know if we missed anything. Let us know if you disagree with anything, if you have anything to add about genetics, about family. You know, if there's stories too. I think family is one that, you know, as we start to build a community around Everyday Sacred, we want to hear more people's stories. We want to bring those in. So please, you know, share that. We're obviously not experts in this or any topic, so please help us keep learning.
If you like what we're talking about, let us know. Go ahead and like and subscribe wherever you found us. Reach out. We want this to be kind of a community effort, and we really want to grow an audience and participants that are kind of like-minded and want to be part of the conversations we're having.
And as always, until the next time we meet, may the road rise up to meet you.
May the wind be ever at your back.
May the sun shine warm upon your face.
And the rains fall soft upon your fields.
Blessed be.
The music you just heard is Spring by Ixen Music. You can find more at ixenmusic.com.